Yeah.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Nana. How are you?
Hi, Njoki. Hi. Sorry, I was having some internet issues.
No problem. It's lovely to have you. Ciao.
Hi, Njoki.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Hi, everybody. I just want to kind of hand over back to Ciao now because she's the host. And then we can proceed from there. Ciao.
All right. Thanks, Njoki. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this last and final session of the Restitution Dialogues and the Object Movement Dialogues. We are hosting this discussion in collaboration with the International Inventories Program, which is a project between the National Museums of Kenya, the Goethe Institute, and the Nest Collective. I'm Chao, and my colleague Molemo, who I don't know if she's on the call, is also here, and we are both from Open Restitution Project Africa. Just a brief introduction to Open Restitution. We recently, Molemo and I recently, actually, when I say recently, I mean like a month ago. So we're talking about the idea of restitution and it being a process. And for us, Open Restitution Africa in itself, in as much as it's a project to collate and centralize data on restitution, it is a process. And we're really glad to be here today. And I think Njoki will introduce Nana, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
And Juma from the museums. Thank you for being here.
Asante sana. My name is Dr. Njoki Ngomi. I am a member of the Nest Collective, and the Nest Collective is one of the constituent members of IIP. The other member of IIP that Chao didn't mention are Shift Collective, who are a gathering of artists and academics who are based in Germany and France, who are also kind of looking into the whole thing of object return and restitution from their perspective and their point of view. That does mean that IIP is full of very, very interesting conversations, some that are conflict, some that have a lot of tension, but all of which have taught us a number of very, very useful lessons over the last few years. I'd like to invite Mr. Juma Ondeng to give us a few words before we proceed into the conversation. Juma.
Thank you, Njoki. My name is Juma Ondeng from the National Museums of Kenya. I would just like to bring to the attention of our viewers that International Inventories Program has so far collected more than 30,000 objects in our database from 30 different institutions across the world, notably Europe and the USA. And we are also working on an exhibition that will be hosted in 3 cities, Nairobi, Cologne, and Frankfurt. The exhibition is titled Invisible Inventories, and is trying to tackle some of these problematic topics. But I also like the topic of today, which is action on return, action on object return in Africa, because I think we have done a lot of talks. What need to move forward? We need to start seeing some objects moving, and that will make our engagement more fruitful. It has been in the last few, I think the last 1 month, the British Museum, just use an example, is trying to come up with a project in Nigeria about excavation, and they're funding something, but I'm not sure if the Benin objects are also going to be part of that. But at least we are seeing that there's some sort of movement that are taking place. So because this is a collaboration with Open Restitution, I would like to hand it. I would like to hand over.
Africa.
Samahani Juma, 1 minute, sorry. Gote, if you could please mute your mic. Samahani. Gote, kindly mute your mic. These moments are always so interesting.
Yeah, Yeah, so because this is a very special collaboration with Open Restitution Africa, I would like to take this opportunity to invite Chao again so that you can take over from me and introduce Nana.
No, it was me who was introducing Nana.
Sorry. Yeah, so Njoki, you can now, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Juma. I think one of the things I think that happens when you have multiple people hosting is that we all get really excited, and so I guess that's kind of what everybody is seeing. Thank you so much, Juma, for giving us a brief on where IIP are, especially as regards the database and the preparations for the exhibition. We're super excited to be able to have Nana Oforiatta Ayim here with us today. Nana has done a lot of work over several years as a cultural worker, as a writer, as an artist in her own right, as well as a museum worker in multiple contexts, both in the diaspora and back home in Ghana. And there's multiple questions that it would be really, really exciting to ask her. And rather than just kind of going to like a reading of, and I never know what people feel when like your accomplishments are being read by somebody else. Like, are you supposed to smile gently? Are people supposed to clap? You know, it can get really awkward, you know. But I'm always much more interested in just kind of diving into the meat of the thing, and just kind of starting to ask you, because of your experience with so many wide arenas of both the arts and culture, and especially with the Anno Institute of Knowledge in Ghana. My first question for you would be, if all of the objects came back the way we want them to come back, what do you think would be the first thing we should do with them? Like, if we imagine past, because we're currently kind of stuck in the embroiling performances of politeness, of writing letters, of modulating our tones and our words, of people refusing to return things that we know are ours, etc. But if we were to fast forward, even in our imaginations, to that moment when all of the things that we have asked for have come back, what do you think that could like kind of awaken in us? What do you think that could give rise to for our cultural contexts?
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for this invitation. I think I'm more excited about this convening than any other talk that I've done recently, just because it's done kind of by us, for us in a way. So thank you for the invitation. I mean, I think even before the objects came back, the thing to do is to talk to the communities the objects went away from, and have a whole engagement. I mean, that's kind of what I'm hoping to do here in Ghana now, is really have an in-depth engagement with the communities that the objects were taken from, and find out from them what would, you know, I can hypothesize in a way what it would mean, but it's a whole nother thing actually finding out from those communities, you know, what does it mean that these objects were taken from you? What gaps did they leave? And what would it mean to you for those objects to come back to you? And of course, they are national questions, but I think also they're very much community questions. You know, a lot of the objects that were taken, you know, as we know, have meaning, have purpose, have some kind of function. Still to this day, when you go into communities and you see how objects are preserved and how they are kept, you know, the kind of mini museums that we have are very active museums. You know, they're shrines, they're drum houses, stool houses, etc. So what does it mean what would it mean to those communities? I think that would be my foremost question.
Even before the objects came back. And so for you, in many ways that there has to be a preparation to receive these objects back.
Yes, I think so. And God, sorry. Yes, I think so. I'm having one of those Zoom moments when something is happening and I'm kind of pretending that everything is fine. Yes, I definitely think that it's a question that needs to be asked to the various communities. And, you know, like I said, I can hypothesize. I can say that I think it will bring about healing. I can say that it will start to make us look again at our own value and re-imbue things that we were told were valueless with more value. You know, as we know in many places in Africa, sometimes when things have been revalued for us outside, they take on new value when they come back. But I think, to me, the most important thing is talking to people, because, you know, they're the objects on one hand, and then there's the people on the other hand, and those two need to come together.
There's one of the projects you've done involved kind of reimagining museumness or museum presence within communities, and it involved the mobile museum, where you carried around a few objects and then had people come and kind of deeply interact with those objects and kind of build their own narratives and stories around them. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how that project went and the interesting reflections that you got directly from people, and what insights that gave you about the place of objects within communities and in the lives of people.
Yeah, I think the Mobile Museum has in some ways been one of the most, or probably the most fulfilling project that I've worked on, in that I've learned so much. Like you said, we've been around the country. Yes, we've brought some objects with us, both contemporary, by internationally recognized contemporary artists, and then also local artists. But then also gone into people's homes and asked them, you know, which objects are of cultural value to you? What do you have in your home museums? Can you tell us stories about them and narratives about them? And learning that, you know, learning about value, really learning about what is it within different communities, you know, what objects is it in different communities that come together as this kind of chain to tell the stories of that community. And it's been such an enriching journey, which again is why when you asked about the objects returning, to me, the most important step is connecting with communities and asking them. Rather than even coming back to the nation as a whole. Of course, that's an important step, them coming back to Ghana or Kenya or wherever they come from and being received as a nation. We are a nation made up of communities, and I think there's that plurality and there's that unity, and I think both of them need to be recognized. And in the Mobile Museum tour that we did, the pluralism that we found and the depth of what is there in terms of knowledge systems, in terms of objects that we do have, in terms of narratives around how objects are made, how they are kept, how they are sacralized, etc., can be so enriching.
I think my question to follow that up would be to just kind of go back to this kind of dual belongings of objects, especially and in our conversations as IIP with our partner institution, the National Museums of Kenya. We've had the phrase objects of national importance, which of course take on a particular type of meaning beyond the meanings to communities that they had when they were taken away, because there were particular objects, and whether they are of political importance, whether they are of spiritual importance, whether they are made of precious things, but those are objects that for whatever reason are well known and are kind of taken into the narrative of the country as a whole, which is also a very interesting thing within an African context, because we know that the belonging to community and belonging to nation are things that sometimes exist at odds. In some senses, sometimes they might be seen to be together, but then we know that when an election shows up, when a political context shows up, these kinds of belongings are then again put at odds to then kind of battle it out for supremacy. And so this idea of an object belonging to the people of a community vis-a-vis belonging to the people of a whole nation then becomes very, very interesting. And in the movement of the Mobile Museum, did you find that people were more likely to skew towards the community or towards the nation, or was there an interesting tension between the two of them?
I mean, I think we're all complex beings and we all have multiple identities, multiple belongings. But obviously your day-to-day environment, your day-to-day context is what really informs you. Sometimes the idea of nation is such an abstract one. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and an and. You know, there's so many, and I think that will be the process. You know, here in Ghana, we're thinking about new kinds of museums, and I've been putting so much thought into how do you create a narrative, or how do you create pluralistic narratives that honor this idea of plurality, of belonging, you know, whether it's to nation, whether it's to community, whether it's to diaspora, whether it's to the global family. So, you know, I think this kind of layering and overlap of belonging and identity is really interesting. And I don't think they have to be flattened. I don't think it has to be either or. And I think in the return of those objects, if we can, at least, you know, again, I can only speak from my context, but if we can acknowledge and honor the fact that they weren't just taken, or they weren't taken from a country at the time because the country wasn't in existence, but they were also taken from communities, and honor, you know, the return in all of those senses. You know, one of the things that I've been trying to do through this cultural encyclopedia project that I have is trace long-term trajectories. You know, the history of our continent is so often, I've said this before, kind of divided into the pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, as if this is all our history is, something that's centered around the colonial narrative.
Project, yeah.
Yeah, and it's so much wider, it's so much longer, it's so much deeper than that. And so one of these projects that I've been working on is of tracing trajectories of knowledge systems, you know, really as far back as I can, to show how these communities formed, to show how these ontologies formed. And I think the idea of the objects coming back and where they come back to and how they link up these different identities is going to be a really fascinating one, and not just a project of healing, but also of rethinking ourselves.
You've said a really interesting thing, which has made me realize that in the ways in which we consider the object a changed entity, because it was kind of taken away, and then it had to stay in a different place, and it was framed in a different way. So even if, for instance, if we had an object that belonged here in a shrine, and then it's taken away, and then it's put up for display, and perhaps in the shrine it was only supposed to be seen by the people of that family, or the people of that homestead, or the people of that community, and then now we give it a different kind of publicness when it's either put away completely in a store among other objects, and it might have been stored in any kind of way. So perhaps maybe it's because it looks like a pot, it's stored with pots, but then it should have been stored with funeral things or something like that. So the object is also a thing in transition, even transitions it did not choose, you know. So it's stored as a pot, even though it's a funeral object, this hypothetical object that we're thinking about. Then along comes a well-meaning curator in this Western museum, who then kind of takes out the object and then reframes it to fit the narrative of a particular exhibition. You know, maybe it's an exhibition of things that come from that place, or maybe it's an exhibition of X and Y and Z, and perhaps the object could be reframed in that context. And then along come people like, you know, IIP or Open Restitution Africa, and then we come and we lobby and we say, no, the object has to come home, and then the museum are like, fine, take your object. And so now the object comes back to this museum that is here at home, and with this long, choppy kind of provenance. And it's also come back to people who changed in their own trajectories, because while the object was gone and going through its things, we were also going through our things. And like you said, the object left us as a community, and then it comes back and finds an evolved community. It finds a new concept called country, and then it finds a new tension there, because sometimes the nation are like, the object belongs to us in this identity frame, and then the community are like, actually, that object is ours. It doesn't belong to the 118 other communities of this country. It belongs to one, and it belongs to ours for this reason. And so there's multiple kinds of conflicts and tensions that the people have gone through and the objects have gone through. And I suppose those types of meetings can then, of course, kind of lead to some maybe even newer ways of belonging than we have ever imagined. And I guess the healing that you're speaking to is the acknowledgement of all of those things vibrating at the same time and the acceptance of them, in a sense.
Yeah, I always kind of I've been teaching this course on history and theory and trying to ground it in a Ghanaian ontology, and I've been doing a lot of listening to the students about what their thoughts. And we had our last class yesterday, and they were saying how they hadn't been in a class where they'd been expected to speak so much rather than being taught. And I was saying to them, I think listening is really undervalued, even within a so-called teaching process. And I think that the processes that you just spoke about, I think listening is key in them, listening to the object. There are people in our societies that, know how to listen to objects, that, that's their kind of life's path, to be able to hear the spirits of things. And obviously you might have contesting people hearing contesting things, but still, listening to the object, listening to the communities, listening. And I think even within that act of listening and that respect that's given within that, like you say, something emerges that you couldn't have imagined because it's just your mind or a room full of people's minds putting something onto something rather than listening to what emerges.
I think an interesting question to ask you at this point in time is around the idea of belonging, and I have a couple of notes on that, and I think it would be an interesting kind of space to go into, because the foundational conflict around an object is who it belongs to. And so even when we talk about the idea on action on objects return, and I referenced earlier this kind of being stuck in the miasma of legalese around this law that has just been that has taken action in Europe, where they can't really tell you who the object belonged to unless they die, such that then you can't really chase after somebody who is alive to ask them hard questions about this particular thing. So even sometimes museums are limited in the kind of information that they can give you for that reason. Then of course there's all of the objects which can be listed as given or donated in different museum provenances, when perhaps that's not really the context in which they got into these spaces. And in that regard, I'd like you to kind of reflect on your time at the British Museum, where like for them, there was no contest about the ownership of the objects. The objects were clearly the museums, right? They clearly belonged to the British. Whatever process brought them there, they were there. They are now in, the stores, etc. And they are not going to move as far as the British Museum is concerned as at now. And perhaps that's why we have all these conversations going on around the idea of even a long-term loan or a permanent loan. And that even a permanent loan means that it still belongs to the person who's loaning it, right? So for them, belonging is not a contest. The contest is now kind of ours. And what is that like? To work in a space like that that's completely just kind of decided it's just not going to hear about where objects belong and who they actually belong to. For them, it's actually not a question, that idea of belonging.
I mean, when I worked at the British Museum, I was working with Gus Casely-Hayford, who was director of the Smithsonian, is now moved to the V&A. And we were the only two Black people in the museum who were not security guards or cleaners. The only two. And obviously, it has the African collection, it has various collections, but it's the makeup of its staff was pretty reflective of its policies, I guess. And I have to be honest, like, I don't expect very much of Western institutions anymore. You know, my focus, and that's why I was saying that I was most looking forward to this engagement, because this is where my focus and my energy is, which is, you know, at home amongst us and what new narratives that we are coming up with, because I've lived there. I know what I'm dealing with, and it's exhausting, to be really frank. It's exhausting. Even the most well-meaning of Western curators or directors, you know, the layers of stuff that you have to deal with, and it's exhausting. I had a issue recently with this whole repatriation project that I'm working on, where all of the African curators, you know, people on board, were offered, I think it was a quarter of one postdoctoral researcher in the Western institution, even though it was supposed to be an African-centered project. And it got to me, and you know, I was just like, of course I can't be part of this. This whole thing is about equality and exchange and respect. And this is a process that you choose to go through this. And it, you know, it was in the height of the Black Lives Matter thing, so they changed it in an instant. But I just know that if it hadn't been in the middle of the whole Black Lives Matter thing, the battles that I would have had to fight just to be respected, just to be valued, not just for myself, but for my other African colleagues. And I think this is just par for the course, you know, that in dealing with Western ex-imperialist people who have never, ever questioned whiteness, who've never questioned privilege, who've never questioned their centeredness, however well-meaning they are, this question of belonging is not a question.
I think the idea of like an unquestioned belonging is part of the definition of what power is and can bring forth. The idea of not questioning the things that are yours because they are yours, and nobody can threaten that, vis-a-vis us who had multiple belongings questioned at the very beginning of kind of this colonial project, and even now are negotiating in multiple ways with multiple types of belongings. And that's why I keep going back to this idea of like the multiplicity of and the tensions between or among, you know, belonging to family versus belonging to community versus belonging to nation versus belonging to the self. Here in Kenya, it was in a very odd way. We recently had, I think it's a draft of what's supposed to be a law about the duties of a citizen, which were very interesting to have kind of laid out, even though for us, in multiple ways, a lot of them had already been laid out in the Constitution. But then these very particular duties of the citizen involved things like telling the citizen that they have to provide for their children, which was odd, you know, because these things ideally are covered in other laws, but in this context, the citizen has to take care of, you know, and that the citizen has to be patriotic in ways A, B, and C, and the citizen has to defend the family, you know, it was very, very odd. But then there's this kind of framing around the duties of citizen to state, while again, also the same state has been quite lackadaisical about fulfilling its own duties to the citizen. So this idea of who belongs to what and why, for me is intractable from the whole issue of the objects. And I think one of the places, and why what you said about talk to the people first, why that's so powerful is that sometimes you can come back to the people and find that maybe they're not even necessarily interested in the objects. Maybe they're interested in what is after the object. So what the object is supposed to have brought without necessarily the object coming back. And I wanted to ask you, do you find that sometimes that's true? Sometimes people aren't even necessarily interested in the object itself, but rather in the symbol of what the object means?
I mean, the people that I've learned the most from, in all ways, I think including this, is from knowledge keepers. When I did the tour with the Mobile Museum, I was, talking to all kinds of people, asking them what culture and what art meant to them, ranging from fishermen to market women to teachers and lecturers and artists and priests and malams. And these artists who are also musicians and what I thought of as traditional priests. And I've known them for several years. When I went to talk to them at the end of the Mobile Museum tour to ask them some questions, they said to me, Nana, we're not traditional priests because traditionally we didn't have religions, we had knowledge systems. And this was the beginning of a really incredibly in-depth engagement with them on learning about these knowledge systems, which were so deep. The knowledge system that they taught or are teaching me has 6 elements, which includes mythology, psychology, mathematics, education, the arts. In education, there are 7 hermetic schools, which includes knowledge of nature, knowledge of the mind and soul, knowledge of cosmology. I mean, it's really intricate. And it's been passed down for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so, I mean, obviously, I think there's interest in engaging with all kinds of people, but I think to me, the most interesting in terms of where these objects belong are the keepers of knowledge, are the people who know or have been, in a way, chosen or selected to guard our knowledge over hundreds and thousands of years, and who understand the deeper significance, the spiritual significance, all of the different layers.
That's a really interesting thought, because then you find then that the object means many things, but then it also stands in representation of these kinds of knowledge systems and of what it meant to live life under these knowledge systems, and that in some ways then, even though all of us are deeply involved in the conversations around bringing the objects back, because objects hold value is economic, value is multiple things, and that those conversations are intractable. But at the same time, there are things that we can be doing that are not only lobbying, and that are not only writing letters to people who don't write back or who ignore the letters in the ways that, for instance, the British Museum has done in multiple ways. There's other stuff that we can do around kind of preparing ourselves around taking these healing journeys, and around kind of figuring out who we are despite all of the things that have happened to our ancestors and by proxy to us. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
I think maybe this is the point in time when we can also have the audience, please feel free to ask questions. If you're here on the Zoom call, please kind of type them here in the chat box. If you're watching us either on Facebook, on the IAP Facebook page, or on the Open Restitution Africa YouTube channel, please write your questions there in the comments, and then we can have Nana just kind of take a whack at them. There's a message from Molemo, who's our co-host from Open Restitution Africa, here in the chat box, and she says, question, really interested in this discussion of the plurality of belonging, which is global stroke state, stroke nation, stroke community. In certain cases, these are conflicting pluralities, and communities of source don't want the state involved in their returns. These questions are at times used to undermine return in broad. And this is very true what Molemo says as regards, if it's just the community that wants the object, then the nation can step back and say, well, it's just them, or the community can be kind of diminished in the view of the museum, and the museum can say it's just a community that wants it back. It's not necessarily become a diplomatic problematic issue, and then so they can pretend it's not happening. What are the ways that we can have these very difficult conversations? Do they need to be family conversations, in quotes? And by family, she means away from the public, red European view.
Yeah, to be honest, I think it's, even without these conflicts, it's important to have these conversations. Again, I'm using this terminology of amongst us, but in a way, I see, for example, here in Ghana, I see my role as, and again, I'm using the same vocabulary, as being the listener, as being, through the Mobile Museum. Yes, it was an exhibition tool, but it was very much a listening tool. It was very much a research tool in terms of finding out from people what they wanted, what was important to them, and not just in contemporary ways, but also historically. It was very much a learning tool. And so I think, those of us who can, becoming avenues or becoming portals or bridges for conversations to happen, and being almost a neutral space between government, between communities, between families. I think, those of us who are kind of actors, activists, cultural actors, who are not tied to either or, can in a way fulfill that role of being the in-between and or creating or housing those voices.
So what you're saying is that, like, again, there's a way for all of these voices to be heard, and for all of their opinions to be valid, even if they don't agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Could you give us an example of a very contradictory opinion that you had in the context of the museum tour, which was not necessarily community aligned, or which was not necessarily nation aligned, as regards the objects, or as regards even the systems of knowledge that you're speaking about?
What do you mean by contradictory? Like,
or a thing that you had that was not like the other things that you had. Does that make any sense? Because sometimes you can find that the vast majority of people have opinions that kind of lean in one general direction if you were to kind of house them thematically. Okay. But then did you hear anything that was particularly moving away from those, or was interested in looking at things from a very, very different point of view?
I mean, I guess the closest to that would be in Accra, we went to a medicine man or healer, and he had these objects that were covered in tar and animal blood, and there were sweets at the feet of the object. Ghana is a highly Christian country. It's Christian and Muslim, but highly Christian, and a lot of people were afraid. And some of my team members, and I'd say that was the object in a way that caused the most conflict, because my view was, we need to understand what we're afraid of before we're afraid. What are you afraid of in this object? What is it? Is it the animal blood? Is it the fact that there's a spirit in it? And he told us, I think there were two objects. One, he said the spirit of the object comes to him at night to tell him things. There were different objects with different kind of spirit purposes. And to me, the unfolding of the narratives of the object came the more he told us about them. But the immediate reaction of most people that came, into contact with this object, and part of the Mobile Museum was that we had the objects in situ, and part of them were either in homes or places around the Mobile Museum, valuable objects that we couldn't take. And the immediate reaction to that particular object was of fear and of suspicion, and of, cover it with the blood of Jesus and keep it far away from me. So I guess that would be the most controversial object in that way.
It's really interesting that, I mean, like one of the things that a lot of people, and especially Black people, have been discussing around, Christian ritual, is that with a blood-covered object, you need to cover it with more blood, while being afraid of this one particular type of blood. And so one of the most interesting conversations that a lot of Black people have been having has been around the very particular and ritualistic elements of Christian faith, where a lot of Christians will say manifesting is evil. But then if you think about the rubric of prayer at its core, it's about summoning things that are not there as though they were, and that these things are the same. And that I think one of the biggest conflicts has been for people on what they deem as one side to see that the other side is essentially the same thing. And as regards this kind of object, this theme or topic that we're discussing, which is action on object restitution, and you saying, let's talk to the people, let's listen to the people. And here in this moment, the people are telling you, we are afraid of this object, and we're not necessarily going to come near that object because this is what this object is telling us, because we were taught certain things about this type of object. And yet there's conflicting knowledge about this exact object, and that then these knowledges have to learn how to sit together, or find a way to be still together, and that we then get into another cycle of listening, which is listening to both sets of knowledge. But then for me, the problem arises because we've been taught that knowledges are essentially supremacist things. And so one knowledge has to take supremacy over another. And so far, what has happened is that the knowledge that has taken supremacy is the knowledge around this object. And if we can use the object in your exhibition, that object being quote unquote a bad object. And so how do we get to the place where people are willing to do listening, even when they're in what can be deemed as the supreme position? Because that's kind of where we are, even around the topic of object return, that the people who the objects belong to are talking, but then their knowledge is not the supreme knowledge. Their ownership is not the supreme ownership. And so that's why the object is not with us anymore. And so if we come back down to the ground where it's still, the battleground is around knowledges, the knowledge that's supreme is around objects being dangerous when they may not necessarily be so. And so how do we begin to allow people to make these things more equal? How do we ask people to listen beyond themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't everyone it was the people that I came with, the people in a way that were more cosmopolitan, the more kind of Accra-based, my team is a very young team. It's Accra-based, it's cosmopolitan. But there were a lot of people that actually went to this medicine man for healing. And some people do it openly, some people do it secretly because, they go to church every Sunday, and that's, at church, it's preached that
that you shouldn't go to the medicine man.
Yeah, this is fetishism, this is evil, it's the devil's work. And yet, if you're sick and you want to save your life, you will try. And you will try the things that your family has tried for generations and generations. And so I think there are different types of approach. There was, the straight up, I can't do this, I'm Christian, this is not for me. And then there was the straightforward, yes, I come here to, I come here in seeking of solace or healing or whatever I come for. And then there's a kind of in between of, I will come here secretly and in hiding. But on the surface and on the outside, I will wear the clothes or the mask of the colonizer. And to be really honest, I feel like most of our country, or my country, is in that in-between space. My mother, who was highly Christian, was very adamant that, people back home in my village were, that many of the women were witches, And that, you know, when I was doing my research, in my field research in Chebi into traditional stuff, you know, she'd sabotage me from going because of all these spiritual stuff, which if you're Christian shouldn't exist for you. You know, it should be that the power of Jesus and God is so much stronger than that you don't really have anything to fear. So there's very much an acknowledgement of the other. But because we've been taught that that acknowledgement is shameful, we hide it. And for me, this process of repatriation, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, is also one of unhiding ourselves, of saying, you know, this crazy process that happened where people came in and said, your objects are evil and devilish and fetishistic. We're going to take them away. We're going to steal them, burn them, whatever, have the Bible. And yet your objects are of no value. And yet we're going to take them and we're going to put them in glass cases and, you know, sacralize them in a completely different way to the way that you sacralize them. But your way of sacralizing them is completely wrong, and be ashamed of it. So that shame that was given to us with the removal of those objects, I mean, obviously this is a kind of idealistic, and it goes back to your first question about, you know, what do you think will happen? What I'm hoping will happen, you know, obviously not just in the process of the objects physically coming back, but in the whole process that comes around that is a kind of de-shamification of ourselves and the things that we've created and the things that were taken from us.
Thank you so much, Nana. Larissa Forster from Berlin has a question. Larissa, if you'd mind asking your question now.
Yes, thank you so much. I can't turn on my video, but maybe that's not foreseen. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And I must say, thank you to both of you for having this conversation and making it accessible for us in the so-called global north, because I mean, as you know, we are having this really fierce and acrimonious debate on return and whether or not and how. And I mean, taking up your words, I would say that many of us don't have an opportunity to really listen. And I think this is one of the first sessions that I'm experiencing where I, as a scholar, you know, from a European and German background, has the possibility to really listen to such a local conversation, or a Pan-African conversation, actually, to learn from, you know, the philosophical reasoning, the spiritual ideas, this discourses here, and I'm really grateful for that. And I think we must open the debate, because in Europe at the moment we are very much debating with ourselves and we're not listening. So, but that's just as a thank you, and I feel really gifted to be able to listen here. But since you've come up with this term of a multiple belonging, which I like very much, I'd like to ask you something a bit pragmatic, maybe, because I believe as well, you know, that there's this layered ownership, layered belonging that objects embody. But then return and repatriation and restitution, at a certain point, decisions need to be taken in order for the objects to be able to be facilitated to move, maybe from Europe to an African country. And I think one of the difficulties that all the stakeholders are having at the moment is when you've got these different belongings and they turn out to be competitive, what then can we do? And I don't want to, you know, there's no one single fit all solutions, of course, because there's so many different discourses and practices and histories. But can you recommend a process or a structure or mechanisms that are already in place as a kind of best practice example, how a process that can make sure that at the end, you know, these different belongings are accommodated when a return happens, and that an object does not, wrongly go to the nation only, but that an object is also not kept or sort of instrumentalized by someone. I mean, it's not about us here in Europe to make any decision on that, but I wonder, is there processes in place even on the continent, how this can be managed, these conversations. And my imagination is that there's a lot of time that is needed in order to have this conversation, because the objects have been away for such a long time. So of course this can't happen fast track, or shouldn't happen fast track. But can you recommend something that we can, coming from a European country, look to and see how these processes work and learn from them?
I mean, I know what I would say, but I think we should hear from Nana first. Nana, what are your thoughts?
I think that, it's just about returning them back to the countries, and the countries decide within themselves what they do. I think this whole debate from the West saying we don't know who to give them back to, it's not, to be honest, it's nothing to do with you. And I'm talking to you as the whole kind of Western kind of, you don't have to think about that. That's not your responsibility. Give it back to the country, the people who are in charge have been chosen as leaders of their countries, and let the countries work that out within themselves. It's not your responsibility in the West to think on our behalves what we will do with the objects once they get back to us. I think there's too much wrangling. There's too much thinking, what will they do when we give them the objects back? Will they be able to look after them? Will we give them back to right people? To me, these are, honestly, they are kind of...
marking time.
Yes, procrastinatory. Yeah, it's not, honestly, you don't have to think on our behalf. Give them back to the people that represent the countries, and then within the countries, each country will work that out for themselves with all the complexities that come with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, just as a follow-up that I understood, so you would say that in any case, I mean, as I said, we are not here to make any decisions, but we've been, Germany had the problem that it gave back objects to the Namibian nation, but there were stakeholders that said, no, it shouldn't have gone to the nation, it should have gone directly to us. And that's the kind of situation that I mean, that where okay, then you have to make the decision, do I give it to the state, or what about the community that says I don't trust in, I don't have the confidence in my own government? What then? What can I do then?
I mean, I think I want to go back to the thing that you had said before, Larissa, which was around the idea of time and these things taking time. I think time is a kind of invisible decision as well. Even in the statement, we don't want to make any decisions. The decision to take time making a decision is still a decision. If you see what I mean. I think if the intention to give back the object is whole and true, it is not that difficult to say that the host country, because the country is the frame that we have, and the community and you guys all need to be on the table when the decision is being made, rather than kind of being in a hand-wringing, what will we do because these people are not agreeing. Like Nana said, it's really like your work is not to make people agree. If the members of the community come back to lobby you when you don't have the object in your hands anymore, but then the conversations between the nations around the capacities that are also coming back with the objects, because one of the bigger conversations that has been had has been around, oh, we don't want to give these objects back because there's no capacity, when a full-scale restitution also involves restituting all of the profits that were gained by the object staying in that place, which involve people coming to visit it, people coming to do research, people coming to write about it, and the institution gaining even in fame because of the object's presence in it. And so to restitute all that, we'll also have to take into account the conversations around how the object will be housed in the place that it's supposed to go back to. But I think if the impetus to return the object is present and true and honest, then pulling the people who have to be at the table to the table to have the conversation around, I am not interested in holding on to this object anymore. What agreement can we leave this table with, right? I don't think it's that difficult, as opposed to staying in one's office and asking, who do I give it to? Because that is still a decision to keep the thing in your pocket, as it were. At least that's how I would put it. I don't know, Nana, if you have any particular thoughts around the idea of, do I give it to the nation or do I give it to the community? Like, is there really an either or there?
I don't think so, but I mean, like I said, I think I've kind of said what I think in this matter is that it's for people to work out, and I think these conversations are happening, maybe not in all countries, but in many of them, from the country level, from kind of individual organizations to the country level, to even the African Union level and ECOWAS level. These conversations are all being had. It's just that they're not getting as much press and media attention as the things happening in the West. So,
actually, Nana, you've said a really interesting thing, which is that people are already having these conversations. And so actually the assumption that the conversation has not been had by the people on the ground, or is not in the process by the people on the ground is a very, can be an erroneous one. I think at this point it would be interesting to ask Juma, if he's still here, Juma Ondeng, because he's the director of public programs at the National Museums of Kenya, and in the context of our IAP work, Juma has told us often about conversations that the public come to have with the museum, because the museum styles itself as the custodian of the objects on behalf of the people. And so sometimes the people are not in agreement with what the museum's plan for the object is, and that those conversations are alive, dynamic, and ongoing. Maybe Juma, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, in regards to objects return, one of the controversies is that while national museums assume that they are the natural custodians of objects, communities don't so we have this as objects return. There's also another internal conflict we have to deal with and negotiate, because certain communities, if those then definitely we are taking them to our own community centers. But then you have others who are, okay, fine, we may lack the internal capacity, but we'll request the national museums to hold it in trust as we sort out ourselves. But then there's also another layer of conflict within communities. Often the communities are also not in agreement of where those objects should go. So those are the kind of dynamics involved in return of objects. So it's one straightforward way that you say, okay, if they return this the particular place, you take them to.
I think understanding that the object was taken in a contentious space, and when it returns, it will return to a different kind of contention, is an acceptance that we should just all kind of take into account. There's no fiction, there's no utopian kind of context in which the object will be returned and everybody will just kind of shake hands and everyone goes home. And I think perhaps this kind of idea that the people who the objects are being returned to may not be able to agree, might not necessarily even be about the people that the objects are being returned to. It's a bigger and wider and kind of deeper anxiety than that. I think if we speak to the idea of belonging being a thing in process, and a thing that is always evolving, and a thing that is either or and it's very, very possible then for an object to kind of come and mark time in a place while people are having the conversations. But for as long as it's marking time, and this is what Nana said, for as long as it's marking time within our border, then we're in a good place, as opposed to it is still in a little box in Berlin or in Dusseldorf. And then everybody in Berlin or Dusseldorf is worried about what we will do with our objects, which has echoes of people worrying that the Africans cannot be peaceful about their own things, or that the Africans don't know how to disagree. And so we'll just kind of hold on to the object until they agree in full before then the object comes back, which, there's things definitely to think about in that regard. Thank you so much, Larissa, for your questions, and Larissa has come and commented and said thanks a lot for your answers. This was very helpful. So thank you, Nana, for sharing your thoughts in that regard. Thank you so much, Juma, also for joining us. I just want to kind of ask the audience if there's any more questions that people might have to ask around this whole idea of multiple belongings, around the idea of the object restitution being psychological and being knowledge-based, being mental, being all of these things, even before the object comes back, as a physical entity, and all of the lovely and very juicy things we've discussed here with Nana today. If there are any questions on the side of the socials for the people who are manning the IIP pages, or the people who are just kind of looking at the Open Restitution socials and the YouTube, kindly let us know if there's any more questions. There's no questions on the socials of the GOTE side. Maybe we can ask also the Open Restitution folks if there's any questions coming from that side. Okay, there's no questions coming from the YouTube side. I think we've given people a lot to talk about. Maybe Nana, I would ask you what your final words are as regards actions on object restitution. And one of my biggest takeaways from you has been that the action is not so much the lobby, even though it is, and it's not so much the public education, even though it is, but much more the listening, and the listening to the people that the objects belong to, and that understanding that the peoples have different belongings, which gives the objects different belongings, and that all of these things have to learn how to sit together. Do you have any kind of parting words for us this evening, Nana?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit to what we're going to be doing here in Ghana, because this is, I guess, like we said at the beginning, or like Juma said, about action, and we are not just talking about this, but we're actually taking steps as well. And right now, the first action that we've taken is to really rethink the whole notion and concept of what a museum is. We took on wholesale the idea and notion of a museum from the West in 1956 when we built our National Museum. Is that something that's still, was it ever relevant? Is it relevant today? Is the museum as we know it from the West the right kind of space in which to engage and exchange and commune and learn? I think for us, or for me, that was the first place to start. And then the second one is to actually find out, to, as wide an extent as possible, is that deals with the objects at home as well as the ones that are coming in, is what objects are where, and then to find out from the communities that those objects went from, what are these objects? What did they mean? Do you remember objects like these? would they come back to you? Would they be held in a national space? If they're held in a national space, what kind of narratives would you want told around them? So, like have this time of like we said earlier, of listening and questioning. And in that process, I'm not saying we should wait until that's over, because it's obviously an infinite process, the process of learning and questioning. In that process, starting with the return of the objects, but with the proviso that as they're being returned, we keep learning about ourselves and about the objects and about their context. I don't think it has to be waited. Like you said, we don't have to wait until everything is sorted out before they come back, because it's an ongoing process. But like you said, it's one thing them still being away from home, so to speak, and being at home and being discovered or rediscovered or rehabilitated. I work with an architect, he's called DK Oseosari, and he's working on the next iteration of the mobile museum, which is going to be made out of bamboo, and he's making it so that it's open source, so anyone everywhere can make their version of the museum. And he was saying that as part of the rehabilitation process of the object, we should in a way like tour them around the country so that they kind of get to know the country
again
and see what the engagement is with people, and in a way letting the object decide where it goes and how, and by the responses that you get from the people. And I loved this notion of the kind of rehabilitation tour of the objects. So I don't know, there's obviously very many ways in which the objects can come back, but I think first of all, knowing which objects are where, and then going about that process. Obviously, we're now at the beginning or in the beginning of putting those strategies of return in place. I think this is incredible, us talking to each other across Kenya, across South Africa, across these different countries, and sharing, sharing what we've done, each of us in our different ways. I know today it was me sharing, but I am as or more interested in, what you're doing, what Chao is doing, what Malemo is doing, and also finding, can we pool our strategies in some way? Can we, the things that I'm finding out here and the things that you're finding out there, can we in a way share those? And yeah, I think, again, to reiterate, there's so much attention on what Hartwig Fischer is saying at the British Museum, on what Tristram Hunt is saying at the V&A, what this curator is saying, what that curator is saying. And like I said, this to me has been the conversation, I was kind of hoping, like I said, that I'd learn as much about you guys and what your work is as I would speak, and hopefully that will still come. But I think to me, there's so much value, because in the end of the day, these objects are coming here. And yes, there is a kind of act of retribution, or whatever you call it, from the West, giving them back. Not retribution is the wrong word. An act of reconciliation or something's happening, with whatever is happening in the West in terms of the return of the objects. But to me, what's interesting is its impact on the continent and, throughout its diasporas. And, these questions of where do they go, to nation, to community, to families, is one that will be different everywhere. There'll be so many answers. And I think also pooling that information between us as well, what did you find here? What did you find there? How did you solve this? What resolution was come to here? Starts us building a body of solutions, or a body of go-tos that we can inform ourselves and each other with throughout this process.
There's one question that has just come from Damiana, who's here on the call. Thank you so much, Damiana, for asking. You used the word lobby several times, and to be fair, I'm the one who used it. It wasn't necessarily Nana. But would it be possible to give us some more information on the lobbying processes? Who are you currently lobbying, and what are the main difficulties in the current negotiations? Who are the most difficult, and difficulties in quotes, interlocutors? Is it museum professionals or politicians? Nana, are you doing any like direct lobbying work around objects in particular?
To Western museums?
Or yeah, I think perhaps actually, or even because this is some lobbying that we are familiar with, lobbying a national museum to be much more open to local communities, because that could be a version of lobbying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would use the word lobbying within the Ghanaian national context, because it's much more about persuading. No, maybe that's the wrong word. To
be fair, persuasion is a lobby of a kind. It's just, yeah. You know, it's just kind of, it smells, it has a different scent, but it's, yeah, the same, it's still perfume, you know?
Yes, I'm not, it's a process, let's put it like that. It's a process of, you know, like in the last 6 months or so, you know, having got our government on board with this to support, not financially, but at least with their mandate, everything that's happening. GMMB is part, the Ghana Museum and Monuments Board is part of this. Yes, that has taken some lobbying, I have to admit. It has taken some lobbying, but I think it's been gentle lobbying. It hasn't been that it's been closed doors. It's been more maybe disinterest and kind of prizing that interest open and kind of saying this is important, you know, along with all the other hundreds of things that you have to deal with. This is important enough to merit your attention and your mandate. In terms of internationally, I mean, I have been in conversation with different museums. Hartwig Fischer, director of the British Museum, came over to Ghana 2 years ago, and I did a workshop with him and some at ANO with him and the team that he came with, and then some practitioners in Ghana, people who are, you know, in kind of part of the whole repatriation discourse. And the thing is that I find with Hartwig Fischer is when you speak to him privately, there's a kind of gap between what comes out in the press statements of the British Museum and what comes out when you speak to him personally. There's a much more of an openness and a flexibility and a fluidity that definitely does not come across when you read the press. And so I think, you know, there's obviously people within institution, and then there's an institutional face and the institutional voice. And I am always going to people directly and trying to kind of make agreements, I guess, with people and kind of circumvent the institution. I know that has to come, the kind of institutional agreement, but I think, you know, like we're doing now, having conversations person to person, it, I guess, is a form of lobbying in a way. Yeah.
I completely agree. I think this question for me is very interesting about who are the most difficult, and difficult being quotes, interlocutors. Is it museum professionals or politicians? I think there's politics in the museum profession in many, many ways. And that also, again, at the same time, because lobbies can look different. The people who are supposed to be in a position to speak to museum professionals or to any types of professionals in many ways are supposed to come with a certain type of respectability, you know, and that is the plague of having any conversations at at an institutional level, that institutions have a way that they want people to come and talk to them. And so those ways tend to privilege some people over others. But then at the same time, you find that communities are and continue to be very powerful lobbies in their own right. And they can find ways of engaging with the museum that then also almost force the museum's hand. And in many ways, for us here, and Juma has said this before to us many times at IIP, that for them, because they hold objects on behalf of the people, if the people come to them and tell them X and Y and Z, then those opinions have to be logged as extremely important and vital to the general conversations around where those objects will go. So there are even objects currently in the National Museums of Kenya that communities want moved from the Nairobi campus of the museum to somewhere that's a little bit more nearer them, so that they say, actually, this is our object and it's nearer us now than it is when it's in Nairobi, you see? And so even that's where the conversation around what is nationally important vis-a-vis what belongs to the community, and if the National Museum stands for the community, then, you know, those conversations are super, super interesting and they must be had. So I guess I think the answer to these questions is, to all of them, is it depends, because it truly depends on the context. But I completely agree with what Nana said as regards speaking to people and people being behind institutions, and that people can always talk to other people, is a really good place to start. At this point in time, I guess I can hand over to, thank you so much, Damiana, for asking the question. She's come and said in the chat box that she's very grateful for the answers. There's somebody who's asked, how do you get involved in the Africa Restitution Project? And I think that would be the Open Restitution Africa project that Jamtan is talking about. And at this point, I guess it would behoove me to hand back over to my co-hosts, Chao and Molemo. Thank you so much, Nana, for this incredible conversation. And yes, can we talk a little bit more? And definitely we can do a conversation that's much more equally weighted, as opposed to me moderating you. We'll definitely do that again, because this isn't the first time that, or the last time that we'll be talking. Thank you so much for all of your beautiful and interesting thoughts around different ways to belong, different ways to listen, and different places for listening, and different ways for objects to come home. And I especially loved this thought that you had around taking the object on a tour of its home so that it remembers what home is. You know, I think that's particularly beautiful, and it's a really lovely way to end the conversation between the two of us. Thank you so much, Nana. I'd like to hand over back to Chao and Molemo, who can also answer Jamtan's question about how to get involved in the Open Restitution Africa project. Chao, Molemo.
Sorry, guys. Molemo, do you want to say hi? I don't know if she's here, but thank you so much, Nana and Jockey, for that very, very interesting and fulfilling conversation. I think I speak to Nana's point on how refreshing it is to be in a space that's created by you or for you, and not necessarily be just thinking about the dynamics of speaking, but speaking from your heart. And that was really, really beautiful. With regards to how someone can join the project, we're still quite young in a sense. Next year, we'll be doing a lot of research, a lot of content creation as we try pulling resources to do this. So I think for now, it would just be to keep the discussions going in your homes, in your workplaces, follow the project online, and we'll definitely have more coming up soon in terms of how people can actually participate and contribute. Yeah, I don't know if Molemo is here.
Thanks, Chao.
Okay, she is.
I am, but my network is terrible. I don't know if you can hear me. But thank you very much to Nana, to Chao, and thank you to Njoki as well. And if anybody is interested in sort of connecting, I think they can also email us. Our contact details are on the website, openrestitution.africa. And we can definitely continue the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight and for following us over the last couple of months. And we really look forward to doing a lot more work in the new year. I'll hand over back to you, Njoki.
Okay, I guess I'll do the goodbye. Chow has put in the chat box that the email for Open Restitution Africa is info@openrestitution.africa. So that's info@openrestitution.africa. On the side of IIP, we definitely have our socials. We are very present on Facebook and on Twitter. If you come and search for the International Inventories Program, you'll definitely find us there. You will also find us on our website, which is inventoriesprogram.com. That is inventoriesprogram with me.org. Sorry, inventoriesprogram.org. It's been super, super lovely to have all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. Allow us to say goodbye, and we'll definitely be back in the new year with multiple announcements. IIP will be looking to host the exhibition that we were talking about at the very beginning of the year, in the first quarter towards March, opening in Nairobi, and then going to Cologne and Frankfurt after that. And we'll definitely have been deeply challenged by some of the really, really lovely insights that Nana has shared around museum walls and ways for objects to speak, ways for people to listen to one another. And we'll definitely be thinking through all of that as well. Thank you so much, Open Restitution Africa, for being such incredible co-hosts. Thank you, Goethe Institute, for hosting us on the Zoom, as well as streaming both live to IIP's Facebook page, as well as to Open Restitution Africa's YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody, for being with us and staying with us an hour and a half into this conversation. It's been really lovely to have you on what is the last conversation of the year for both of us, both IIP and Open Restitution Africa, and we're really looking forward to seeing you again in 2021. Thank you so much, and have a lovely, lovely, lovely evening. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, and Jockey, Molemo, Chow.
Thank you so much, Nana.
Thanks, Nana.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.